Hello, and thank you again for joining us for another episode of Three Questions. I'm Paul Saunders with the Center for the National Interest. I have a little bit of a first today in two respects. The first being that I actually have two guests rather than one. And the second being we're talking about a book, which I haven't done yet on the podcast, and I'm very much looking forward to doing today. So I'm really thrilled to have with me James Harmon, who is chairman of the Egyptian American Enterprise Fund, a former chairman of the Export Import Bank, and an investment banker who was chairman and CEO of a firm called Schroeder Wertheim and Company, and also a chair emeritus of the World Resources Institute, by the way, another really fantastic organization. With him and also with me, Cornelius Queen, who's a senior vice president at the Egyptian American Enterprise Fund, has experience working on Capitol Hill and also managing humanitarian aid programs in Lebanon. And Jim and Connie, together with Mark Warren, who's a former executive editor at Esquire and at Random House, have written this really interesting book, A Daring Enterprise, a U.S.-Egyptian Partnership and the Case for Soft Power. The book is out now, and I encourage everyone who listens and is interested to go find it at your favorite bookstore or on Amazon or wherever else you like to buy books. So, Jim, Connie, thank you very much for being with me today on Three Questions.
Our pleasure.
Really delighted to have both of you here. Just to start out with a fairly basic question for our listeners today, some of whom are not inside the Washington Beltway or, not in New York or other finance centers. You're writing about this Egyptian American Enterprise Fund. What is an enterprise fund? How does it work? Where did the money come from? What did you do with the money? What is it?
An enterprise fund is a fund created by the United States government, financed by, of course, through Congress, to support the economic development in certain countries where the United States feels we can help in creating a better environment for economic development. It's a form of economic support done through a fund which is managed by the private sector. Connie and I are part of the private sector that manages the Egyptian American Enterprise Fund, which was created by the United States in 2011. And we have been investing in Egypt to help Egypt's economy.
And how big is it, the Egyptian American Enterprise Fund?
The Congress gave us $300 million, and we started to invest in 2015, late 2014. And we're pleased to say that an estimated market value of the enterprise fund today is something more than $500 million. So we have grown the enterprise fund for the American people. Neither of us have a direct interest in the success of it, but we have been responsible for helping to grow the fund to the larger size now. And when it's liquidated, which will probably be under the original legislation, probably in 2.5 years, the funds go back to the United States Treasury. Half of the funds go to the Treasury, and the administration at that time will decide what to do with the other half.
That's great. It sounds like a real success. I mean, can I just ask, maybe just to follow this thread for a minute before turning to the next set of questions, what kinds of projects does a fund like that invest in, and how big?
When you say what kinds of politics, you mean?
Projects, I'm sorry. What kinds of projects, businesses, or how does the fund make its money?
So I'm going to share this with Connie. So Connie, you can take that question, and then we'll share the questions back and forth.
Thanks, Jim. And Paul, in Egypt, we've primarily made equity investments. So we've taken small shares of companies through either majority or minority stakes and help them grow to the next level where they can either exit and sell to a regional investor or have an IPO on the Egyptian stock exchange. And so we've primarily invested in companies. We haven't made loans. It's been primarily a private equity and venture capital model. We've invested through 7 first-time fund managers in Egypt. So what that means is we help support first-time private equity and venture capital fund managers, and we give them the seed capital where they can go out into the market under our guidance and source and invest in investments and companies on our behalf. And they come back to our board of directors and we approve those investments. And so we've invested across venture capital and private equity in over 150 companies through these first time fund managers. And we've invested in sectors like consumer finance, financial technology, agriculture, education, and healthcare, for example. One of our main investments, probably our most successful investment, to give your readers an example of some of the work we do, is in a company called Faraway, which is the largest electronic payments platform in Egypt. It extends digital financial services to 55 million Egyptians, which is almost half the population. And that's an important investment because it was part of an early effort by the enterprise fund to help expand access to financing and basic financial services to Egyptians, many of whom don't have access to a bank account. And that company, just to give you a sense of its development and financial impact, we've invested $20 million in 2015. We've generated almost 100 million in proceeds, and we still have a significant stake in the company that's valued northwards of 50 million. So this is a hugely successful investment, primarily because of technology and expanding access to digital payments for Egyptians. And on a developmental basis, like I've said, it reaches half the population with access to financing. Almost every citizen uses Fauri in Egypt. And it also provides financing to small and medium-sized enterprises in Egypt, a little over 300,000.
It's managed the private sector. The funding comes from through Congress, the original 300 million, but the actual determination of where we invest it and when we sell it, it's all managed by the private sector. So it's a true partnership between the public and private sector.
I think for our listeners, that means, no government bureaucrat sitting in an office somewhere, trying to decide what's a good investment, but real, private sector investment experts applying their skills and experience to the task. That sounds like a really kind of fascinating effort. Moving on maybe to a second set of questions here, I was really struck, Jim, as I was going through the book and reading this, very personal narrative that you were giving at a lot of points, and really very kind of compelling at some times. You were trying to operate in an environment kind of in the wake of a revolution in Egypt. This was the time of the Arab Spring that I'm sure many will remember. I recall in part of the book, you're talking about, trying to get through this enormous and sort of dangerous, angry crowd, in Cairo. There are other big challenges in environments like that, with corruption, with human rights. You've got the Congress back here in the United States, kind of always closely watching over the shoulders of anyone who has been given taxpayer money. At the same time, you've got Egyptian officials who weren't really sure exactly what you were trying to do, or whether they could really trust you. How do you operate and succeed in an environment like that? It seems like a really tough task.
A very important question and a good question, but clearly on my first trip there, which I think was 2013 or so, the violence in the main square of Cairo was so great that even though I had two talented young women and some security with me, we were surrounded, and cars were being turned over and burned. I honestly thought that, how did I ever get myself into this position? This is a crazy, the kind of violence taking place. on literally the first trip, but I had made a decision to visit the Muslim Brotherhood, which the United States government didn't fully agree with me on. I was trying to get a feeling, since they represent as much as 50% of the voting population, to hear from them about the United States, how they felt about us making investments and so forth. But the trip itself was enough to make me feel I should be home in Connecticut. But it's a very tough environment. There's no question about that. I knew right away the main decision. I could not put Americans on the ground. Americans, good business people, smart, capable people, you couldn't put them in that environment, in my judgment. Too much violence, they wouldn't wanna do it. So, we had to find Egyptians who knew us and who we trusted, who could work with, who could help find the investments that were most profitable for the venture. That was the first and most important task that I felt coming back on the first or second trip there in the first year. How do we find them? And I asked my young Egyptian assistant, who was working, frankly, for me in my investment banking firm, who was the most successful Egyptian? Who's made the most money here from an investor? And who was the most capable, you think? And she says to me, his name is Nassif Sawiris, and he doesn't live in the in Egypt now, he lives in London. We called him on the phone and we asked him if he'd see us. He said, "Great, I'll see you right away." So the next day we caught a plane. I and Prashanti Vidyaraja, who worked for the State Department as a young woman, and Ola El Shawarbi, our Egyptian colleague, both young women, and we flew to London and we met with Nasser. And he asked me, show him a list of people we're thinking about running the fund. We showed him a list. He said, none of these people can do it. I know who can do it for you, and he's my investment banker. And I was actually fascinated. I said, "Great," and we called him. His name was Ashraf Zaki. Ashraf Zaki, we met with in my New York office a week later, and I knew after talking to him for half the day or so that he could do. He was very receptive, except when I proposed that we were gonna pay him $500,000 a year, which I thought was a generous salary. He said, I'm not gonna work for the United States government." And I thought, "Wow, we came a long way, went to Egypt, go to London, come back, and now I meet the man who can do it," but he turns me down. And he turned me down, he wouldn't even discuss more. He's just not gonna work for the United States government. So I excused myself, I went back into my office, and I thought, "I gotta come up with a smart thing to do, I want this guy." So I went back in the room and I said, "How about we work for you?" And he thought I was being sarcastic, and he said, "What does that mean?" I said, "We'll give you the money. We'll give you the money that the Congress authorized for us, what we can, and you make the investments as long as you keep me informed, and I have the right to give you opinions on what you're doing." And he eventually accepted that approach, and so we formed this fund, which is called Lorax today, and we started to respond to his ideas of what to invest in. He came up with 2 very exciting companies, and that's how we started the whole fund, and we provided the funds for him. To this day, I'm grateful. I met Ashraf, and he's become a good friend over the years, and with the investments we made, we got an enormous jump on the venture that we had. So I'll stop and say, Connie, do you want to add anything to what I said?
Well, I have kind of I have my own question that I might ask Connie but I mean, Connie, please, say whatever you'd like to say in response to what Jim said. But I'm kind of intrigued, Jim, to hear you describe the approach. In some respects, it's almost kind of the opposite approach to how the United States and other Western governments might do development assistance. And I don't want to kind of oversimplify that very complicated debate, but there's often a lot of criticism in the case of development assistance of the Westerners kind of parachuting in and trying to tell everybody what to do to boil all of that down to its most simplest form. And it sounds like you were in many respects doing the opposite. And Connie, you have some background working in humanitarian programs. I just wonder, maybe you could comment on that and then anything else you'd like to say about Jim's point.
Yeah, so just to reiterate, I mean, the environment in Egypt, and I was there too in a different capacity after the revolution, working for the Carter Center. There was a lot of political instability on the ground. There was pockets of anti-Americanism. There was opposition from the Egyptian government to the Enterprise Fund and U.S. Egypt policy coming out of the Obama administration. So it was a difficult operating environment. And as Jim mentioned, he had to Egyptianize the fund. This had to be seen as a locally led effort. Egypt is a proud country. It has an ancient history. And so you couldn't put Americans on the ground in that kind of environment. And so I think what made this venture so successful is that Egyptians have always led it. It's been primarily Egyptian led. We obviously have a board of directors that's from the United States as well as Egypt. All of them have private sector expertise, but Egyptians help and make these investments. And they're the ones on the ground sourcing the portfolio and managing our assets. And they're the ones coming to us with different ideas. And we also have an Egyptian American investment team here in New York who goes back and forth and helps invest and assess the ecosystem in Egypt to find the right managers to do this fund. But I would say it's an interesting model because it's locally led private sector development. And so these fund managers like Ashraf Zaki and Lorax, who Jim mentioned, they're going to keep investing in Egypt into the future, even after we liquidate and return the capital back to the United States. So it's a sustainable, inclusive, private sector led model because these folks are the backbone of private equity and venture capital ecosystem, and they'll keep investing into the future. And I think that that's an interesting, part of the model, which is encouraging locally led private sector development.
Once I made the deal with Ashraf that we would help provide the funds, I would talk to him every Sunday and most weeks, twice a week, for hours, as he would tell me why this investment makes sense, why this would not. And I had a real partnership. It became as close to Ashraf. His English was as good as any of ours. And he was very open in telling me where I was wrong or why he wanted to do it this way. So very good partnership. Now he has spent 5, 6 years in the United States working for a firm here. I think it was with Morgan, but Ashraf was, in my judgment, key. Now there were several others who also were very important. I realized that there was talent in Egypt. There was talent in Egypt. I just had to get them to help us find the right investments. And once we could do that, we would make the investments. And I was much less worried about the kind of violence that I saw when I first arrived.
It's really reading the book and hearing you talk about it. I mean, it's really an impressive success, taking it, from 300 million to 500 million, and having the kinds of impacts, that Connie described. You mentioned the payment firm and in Egypt that you invested in, and the kind of consequences that had for access to financial services in Egypt. I guess I think the big question that I imagine a lot of Americans would kind of ask today about something like this is, yes, it made money and yes, it had an impact, but kind of why is this the role of the American government to do something like this? Couldn't a lot of these things happen anyway? Wouldn't it be better just for the private sector to do it? How would you connect what you did at the fund to American national interests and kind of put it into like a broader framework of U.S. priorities, for Americans who they kind of look at their tax dollars and they wonder, why should money go towards something like this instead of towards something else, even as successful as it's been.
Let me start by saying The United States has not done particularly well in the Mideast with the troubles that we've had and I can't, of course, we've all read the newspapers all the time about the difficulties in the Middle East right now. One has to conclude that the United States can do better than what we've done in the Middle East in the last 5 years. And I think it doesn't really make sense to strengthen our military and to go in there with more troops and have more casualties and fight the Iranians or anybody else there. The whole, in my opinion, area of violence that we could have, any U.S. government might have thought more about doing, did not prove any success in the Middle East. We've not done well in the Middle East. So our story about how we were able to make significant profits and create 75 plus thousand jobs in Egypt has to be looked at like, could this not be done in other countries? Could it not be done in most of the frontier and developing world where we don't want to put our troops in and take the risk of casualties? So we didn't tell the story until now because I felt that we might create some problems in the current administration of Washington because we didn't consult with them on in telling the story and writing the book. Now we've gone public with the book. I suspect with the number of questions that Connie and I are receiving from all sorts of sources, and as we tell it, I think Washington is going to wake up to the concept of soft power used appropriately with the right people probably can be done in most every frontier and developing country and make it's a very important decision for our foreign policy, as opposed to just saying we're going to expand our military in this country or that country, and all of a sudden, all over the world, we have thousands and thousands of military, and the danger to us and the cost to the United States is there's something wrong with that. So you have to conclude that soft power, if it's done the right way, as we did in Egypt, quietly building relationships and quietly creating jobs, has to be a better way for us to build the relationships for Americans in many, many countries around the world. So I'll stop here and ask Connie to make any comments on it.
Sure. Thanks, Jim. And just to go back to the question, Paul, and to connect it back to Americans who may be asking why their taxpayer dollars are going to a country in the Middle East, Egypt, where maybe some folks, aren't too familiar with. And I would just say these are all valid questions, especially now in an environment where prices are going up and folks are frustrated with government and rising gasoline prices. I think it's valid to ask, why are we supporting Egypt? I would just say Egypt is a key strategic partner of the United States. It's the largest country in the Arab world. There's over 100 million Egyptians. They say 1 in 4 Arabs is Egyptian. So it's a huge country in the region. It's home to the Suez Canal, which processes 12% of global trade, and which also Egypt provides the U.S. military preferential access through, so it can project power in the Middle East, especially now in Iran. And Egypt's also the only Arab country that borders Gaza, and it was the first country to make peace with Israel. And so Egypt is a key mediator currently in the Israel-Hamas conflict. And also it's been involved in back-channeling efforts recently to help de-escalate tensions with Iran. So all that to say is Egypt's an important regional security partner of the United States. It's a linchpin of U.S. national security interests in the region. And so its stability matters for U.S. national security. But Egypt needs help. It needs investment. It's primarily a state-led economy. The private sector is crowded out, meaning that they don't have the same access to capital that businesses do here in the United States. And so supporting Egypt's stability and helping make it a stronger partner of the United States helps advance U.S. national security. And so we think in this kind of current environment, as Jim mentioned, this model, helping support stability and advance long-term security in the region and doing it through private sector development that generates a return for the taxpayer, is a really interesting soft power alternative to some of the limits of hard power we're coming up against currently in the region.
Thanks, Connie. And I guess Jim actually just I'm sorry to interject, just to maybe to come back to you and Connie if you'd like to make any kind of final comment. I mean, it sounds to me like what the two of you are talking about is kind of a different model of American leadership, or at least an important potential component of a different model of American leadership in the world that's kind of relying perhaps to a greater extent on investment and commerce and real partnership, and perhaps a little bit less on some of the other tools.
No, I guess correct. What we have found is there is talent. There is talent in many frontier and developing countries. Many of the people we would talk to have gone to school in the United States, or they know friends or family and so forth. So there are good people in many African countries, many Asian countries. So if you are able to support them and you're helping them to create jobs in their country, and they go to work to help you to invest funds, we, the United States, can be successful in a lot of other developing and frontier countries. So could be the most important development in our foreign policy.
Jim, I think you're absolutely right. And I would say right now, this is a real American driven private sector led model that's a great alternative to, I think, some of the more adversarial, extractive foreign policy practices of some of our adversaries, across the world, including China. I mean, this is not something that we're going into another country and nationalizing or trying to take advantage of their local assets. And we're not putting American citizens on the ground to run these investments and to build infrastructure in these countries. We're relying on local talent, and we're doing it through American long-term capital, and we're pairing that with local expertise. And because it's a model that supports locally led development, is focused on partnerships, we're really helping make friends, and I think project American influence in a way that represents the best of our values and also makes a return for the taxpayer. And so that's a win-win, I think, for everybody. It's a win-win for the local countries. It's a win for the taxpayer. It's a win-win for our national security. And so we think that model can be replicated in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, or Southeast Asia to help advance U.S. national security interests as it relates to critical minerals or supporting economic diplomacy with countries in Southeast Asia. So the model is very flexible. It's private sector led, which gives it, an agility and nimbleness that you wouldn't get from a larger bureaucratic organization. And right now it meets the moment because the Trump administration, as you know, is focused on commercial diplomacy and foreign policy with a high return on investment. And so I think this program is America first. That checks all the boxes, and the track record in Egypt speaks for itself. What we didn't say is the 500 million that we've made, we've doubled the money of the taxpayer. We've done that in an environment where the Egyptian currency has lost 80% of its value against the dollar. So that leads us to believe, coupled with everything that Jim had mentioned about relying on Egyptian talent, that if you can do this in Egypt, you can do it in other countries.
Readers or people who talk to us, they like to hear stories. And so when we wrote this book, we tell the truth. We tell there's no punches pulled here. We have told what happened. In fact, in the first, I don't know, 200 pages or 100 pages, um, where I'm describing the difficulties the first few, you could conclude, why did I stay there? Why didn't I go back home into Connecticut? This was crazy at this point in my career where, frankly, I'd been successful in investment banking. My work in Clinton administration had been successful. But this was the last thing I needed. That is the question readers will have. If they read this, they will see we really had challenges. We had challenges through the beginning, and we had challenges later on, and getting the Egyptian government to support what we were doing and not getting the interference from USAID, because they actually eventually helped us and didn't interfere. So having a free hand to do what we wanted in investing and not having to have a U.S. government or the Egyptian government looking at every step we made allowed us to do what we did. And that's a key part of the success that we had.
It's definitely a really powerful narrative, and I think a strong message from the book, and something I hope many will kind of pick up and take a look at. So, thank you to you both, James Harmon and Cornelius Queen, for being with me today on Three Questions. Again, to remind the listeners, we're talking about their new book, A Daring Enterprise, a U.S.-Egyptian Partnership and the Case for Soft Power, which they've written together with Mark Warren. And the book is really telling the story of the Egyptian American Enterprise Fund, and a lot of ups, downs, twists, turns in a very personal way, and I think a really engaging and interesting narrative. So thank you both so much for being with me today.
Thank you for inviting.
Thank you.